Good morning, grandkids. Today's video is about the kings and queens of England. Good morning, grandkids. Today's ancestry video is about popes and archbishops. Stay tuned to see how that works. I can hear Kaitun now saying, "Are there two grandpas?" Nope, it's just one grandpa wearing two different hats. So, okay, we ended our last video talking about King John and how one of our ancestors signed the Magna Carta, which limited his power. So that happened in the year 1215, meaning that this year is the 800th anniversary of that event. So it's kind of a big deal. Well, for almost 300 years after that event, not much really happened in our family as far as our family is concerned. Several kings came and went. Our Mallet ancestors went on living in the castle near Bristol. We don't know anything about the rest of the family except they're scattered across a half a dozen European countries. So then everything began happening at once. The next big event in history happened. In 1440, Gutenberg invented the printing press. By the way, there's a replica of the original printing press at the Museum of the Bible in Washington, D.C. Your grandma and I had the chance to see it and see it demonstrated, and we actually have a souvenir page that they printed that day. It's a really neat thing to see. You should see it if you can. So why was the printing press important? Well, it paved the way for people to learn how the Catholic Church had moved away from the Bible, and we begin to unravel the monopoly that the Catholic Church had. By this time, the Pope and other leaders of the church were teaching things very different from what the Bible says. Yet they were claiming that the Bible supported them. So how did they get away with this clear untruth for what turned out to be hundreds of years? Well, it was a combination of ignorance and a habit of quickly eliminating anybody who disagreed with them. Now, the vast majority of people in Europe couldn't read or write at this time. The ones that could usually read only their own language and not Latin, and all Bibles were in Latin. So all these people had to rely on the leaders of the church to tell them what the Bible said. So most of the people who could read Latin were either leaders of the church, or they were supported by it, or they didn't have an interest in what the Bible said, so they kept quiet. If someone came along who did challenge things, the church used local governments to prosecute them as a heretic and had them killed before their message could reach others. It was kind of like living with the mafia. As long as you don't cross them, they leave you alone. Then came the one who got away. In 1517, Martin Luther posted his 95 Theses, and he started the Protestant Reformation. The goal was to bring Christianity back to the teachings of the Bible. The Catholic Church tried to catch him and kill him. This summer, when we were in Germany, we stopped at St. Anne's Church, which is in Augsburg. So a very famous event happened there. A man named Cardinal Cajetan was sent by the Pope to get Luther to either admit he was wrong or be excommunicated and killed. His choice was you either say the word recant or die. They met in this church, and there's a dramatic reenactment of the conversation that you can witness today. It's a neat place. He was saved by when his followers helped him escape secretly. Another time he would find refuge briefly in a castle in Bavaria. This is a castle that we had the chance to visit. Well, the one we visited is a rebuilt version of the one he stayed in. It was called Hohenschwangau. It's near Neuschwanstein Castle. Luther put his messages in print, and the printing presses helped spread them across the parts of Europe. Before the Pope could catch him, it was too late. People were beginning to get Bibles in their own language. They were beginning to read the words of Luther, and suddenly there were new reformers and new followers everywhere. Okay, so Eleanor, it's your turn to ask the question. What does this have to do with our family? Well, I'll answer that question right now. John Fox was born the same year that Martin Luther started the Reformation. He was your 17th great-grandfather. He was a studious child, and he enrolled in Oxford when he reached teenage years, where he encountered the Reformation and rapidly became convinced that the reformers were right. He spent his life as a preacher and a teacher, but he's most famous as a writer. He was the author of a book called Fox's Book of Martyrs. Now, remember how I said the Catholic Church had survived for so long by killing all the people who opposed them? Fox spent years collecting all these stories, showing how brutally the Catholic Church had treated people who were believers simply searching for the truth. All across Europe, rulers were being forced to choose sides. So, in England, it's King Henry VIII. He had an argument with the Pope and formed the Church of England. But it wasn't really a Protestant church. It was still Catholic in teaching without recognizing the Pope. So he left it to his 3 children to decide where it would go from there. His son Edward took the church toward the Reformation, but his reign was short. Daughter Mary, often called Bloody Mary, tried to bring it back to Catholicism. Her reign was also short. By the way, while Mary was in power, your grandfather, great-great-great-great-grandfather, had to flee the country so that he didn't become one of Bloody Mary's victims. But Queen Elizabeth I, third child, reigned for a long time, and she steered the church back to Protestantism and away from the Catholic Church. It was still not enough for some of the Puritans, some of which are your ancestors, and they would leave the country as a result. For many years, John Fox collected his stories, and he published them as a book while Queen Elizabeth I was queen. It became a bestseller, one of the first bestsellers in history. It was the most widely read book in England outside the Bible. It shaped the entire country's attitude toward Catholics and the Reformation for many, many years. Okay, well, that's one person in your family tree. What are other people doing at this time? Well, there's a guy named John Royal. He was busy making shoes for Elizabeth I and for James I, the man who followed her. He's the one who sponsored the King James Bible. John is your 13th great-grandfather. Sir Richard Bourke was an earl in Mayo, Ireland. We'll talk about him next time. Those of you who visited London, you may remember the Tower of London, where people were locked up and often executed. Well, one of Bop Bop's ancestors is John Lewis Williams, and he wound up a prisoner there twice, and he lived to tell about it. Another relative on Bop Bop's side of the family is Sir James Bacon, an alderman in London. That's kind of like the city council. But most of his family is still in Ireland and Scotland during this time. Meanwhile, Grandma's family are mostly in Germany, Switzerland, and Austria. The Reformation would affect them differently than it affected our British family, and we'll learn about that soon. But the ancestor that Anna would probably be most fascinated by is Grace O'Malley, a 13th great-grandmother from Ireland, known as the Pirate Queen. When her sons and brother were captured by the British, she promptly sailed to London to see Queen Elizabeth and asked to get them back. And she did. Google her if you're interested. More on that next time when we talk about ladies, knights, and villain. They're fascinating stories, aren't they? More importantly, there are stories. Thank you all. Love you.